If you've listened to any of the other interviews in this series, one of the things I'd like to hope you've gotten out of it is that all of us have got a role to play in suicide prevention. But if you're still feeling a little bit uncomfortable about having that conversation, there's things you can do to help. You might not know that there's training available to help you help someone who's at risk of suicide. Much in the same way that first aid and CPR can help an injured person stay alive until the ambulance arrives, mental health first aid and QPR are the mental health equivalents, giving you the tools to assist someone in a mental health crisis until professional help gets involved. We're in Wonthaggi, speaking with Linda Rowley, a mental health first aid trainer, about what suicide prevention training will teach you to do and how it helps people at risk. And alongside her is Ben, who's gone through the training himself with Linda to tell you about how he's used some of those skills in his daily life, and how you can too. First, we asked Linda about what suicide prevention training actually does.
It's a bit of a myth-busting exercise as well as a skills-building and capacity-building exercise. Historically, we've had particular thoughts or views about suicide that research is now telling us just clearly aren't true. For instance, historically, we've thought that it's best not to ask someone if they're thinking about suicide because you don't want to put the thought in their head, right? Whereas we know now that you can't put the thought or the idea in someone's head. So if a person's vulnerable, they may already be thinking about it, and we know that opening up that conversation, so asking them the direct question around suicide, is likely to let them know that they're not alone. There's, people they can trust, they can talk to and open up about. So that helps people feel, less alone, more connected. And then, of course, you can assist the person to get appropriate help. And some people just feel uncomfortable. Like in the training, people will often say, but hey, what if I ask someone, are you thinking of suicide? And they get really angry at me, like, what do you think's going on? All of that sort of stuff. And my view is always, well, isn't it better that they might be a little angry at you because you're off point or off base, as opposed to not asking the question and, the person is thinking about suicide. So I think it's about being able to have those conversations in a kind of compassionate way and in a courageous way.
And a lot of those terms and a lot of that sort of thinking, I guess, will be familiar to someone who has done first aid, in that we're thinking about, okay, yes, doing CPR might break somebody's ribs, but that's better than, them not being here tomorrow.
I think that's a great analogy because there's a range of trainings available when we're looking at suicide prevention. So one of the trainings available is called QPR. So the QPR is kind of like the mental health first aid equivalent of CPR, in that CPR, obviously with physical first aid or medical first aid, you have your steps. So you have your doctor's ABCD, and then you have CPR, which is very specific around, the heart attacks and that sort of thing. So similar with mental health first aid. So we've got mental health first aid, which is a broader training that has a range of actions similar to the doctor's ABCD, and you'll learn about those actions when you come, if you do, mental health first aid training. And then there's QPR, which is really specific to suicide. QPR is kind of like the CPR equivalent of physical or medical first aid, whereas mental health first aid is that broader approach. It also teaches you how to recognise the signs and symptoms of common mental illnesses, in addition to being able to intervene if you're concerned that someone may have suicidal thoughts. And, there's other training as well. Mental health first aid also have a 4-hour conversations about suicide course, and there's also more specific suicide prevention courses. So there's like the assist training, which is applied suicide intervention skills training as well. So I think the takeaway here is that there's training to suit everyone, depending on their level of interest, availability, their skills and capacity. There's something for everyone, and I think, again, everyone has a role to play when it comes to suicide prevention.
And it also doesn't sound to be completely onerous. People might be worried that they walk into a training and suddenly they're expected to become the social worker, or suddenly they're expected to become this expert in, mental health. But you're saying that there's some very concrete steps that you can go through that will actually guide you through the process of talking to somebody about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also being clear about what the boundaries are, right? So you would only offer assistance to someone if you were in a good place yourself, if you felt you had capacity. None of these courses will teach you to be a social worker or a psychologist or a mental health nurse. What they will do is provide you with the skills and ability to intervene in those specific instances. And most of the courses do include elements around referring or encouraging appropriate professional support. So it's not about the mental health first aider or whoever it is being kind of everything to the person and providing ongoing support. It's really about being able to intervene appropriately and respond appropriately kind of in that moment, and then encouraging those more appropriate longer term or professional supports.
Ben, I'll bring you in at this point. Do you maybe just want to give a bit of background about who you are and how you came to suicide prevention training?
Sure. I'm a product of Linda and Michelle, I think you would say. I'm the guy that doesn't have 30 years experience in it, but has just done some of this training. So I'm actually a chef by trade. I had restaurants until COVID. Then I started studying mental health. One of my good friends took his own life. So I met Michelle at an Are You OK Day after we lost my friend there, and she asked if I'd like to be part of the mental health first aid. And then I did QPR as well. QPR was quite amazing. I really liked that because it was really layman's terms on how to attack suicide prevention straight on and nice and easy.
What has changed about your perception of suicide prevention from before you did the training to sort of after you've done the training?
I was never confident about talking about it at all. I have a family member who's bipolar and was suicidal before he was diagnosed. And trying to talk to him, I remember it back then, it was quite, the questions that I asked and the things that I said were wrong, and I should have come at a different angle. And not that it's any fault of my own, but he's fine now, by the way. It's all good. I think now I feel like a bit of a guard dog. I'm always listening. I'm working at a school at the moment. I have one participant, but I can hear the other kids and I just notice different things with them. And I guess that's part of it as well, is really listening for those triggers and those cries of help.
One of the things that I always find interesting when you're learning about something like this is the idea that you kind of don't know what you don't know. Were there any big surprises for you in kind of coming into the training and going, oh, wow, I guess I didn't really know that was wrong, or I didn't know that I could be wrong about something like that?
I really started it with why someone would do this, and how could they be so selfish was sort of my idea before. And then after coming out of it, going through it, you have a deeper understanding of depression and anxiety, how simple questions can change lives. And just even starting a dialogue can save someone's life. Simple dialogue.
Was there any difference in kind of your, I guess, level of confidence in having those conversations with people? And has the training been something that you've gone on and used, or is it one of those things that it's just always in the back pocket ready to come out?
I ran into an old chef that I worked with and I could see it straight away. There was something wrong. And just went and sat down and we had a chat and just asked him if he had any thoughts of harming himself or if everything was okay. And he'd been kicked out of his house and he was sleeping in a car and he had nowhere to go. He had no one to look after him at all. So I have a little place in the back of my house and I put him in there and we fed him and we got him ready for the next levels to get back out there and find somewhere to stay. But if I just walked past and said, "How you doing?" he would have said, "Yeah, I'm all right." But just starting the dialogue, just having that little conversation, I found out everything.
That's awesome. And I guess that's awesome in the way that you said that it didn't sound like it was a big difference from, hey, how you going, to the conversation that you ended up having. It just sort of seemed like one of those tiny little flow-on effects. Also, it kind of unlocked the door a little bit to the rest of what was sitting behind it.
Just ask the right questions until you can shut your mouth and let them go. Yeah. Use your active listening and just take it, just absorb it in. I think the biggest skills is just the listening and just being able to spot anything. And if you have ever lost anyone to suicide, you'll always think about what I didn't do. You'll always have that conversation. No matter how much training you've done, you'll always have that. And it's just about using as much as you can that you've learnt to be able to try and get that response.
Is there something you would say to kind of encourage other people who might be thinking about doing some extra training to do it?
Yeah, I think all organisations should have someone that's just as much as having your first aid, there should be someone who's a mental health first aider as well. That can be spotting, if not everyone in the organisations. Important for any group or any people that just to have that skill is extremely important.
Linda, I might bring you back in at this point. Like Ben says, if we had lots and lots of people who had these sorts of skills, what impact do you think we'd have on society as a whole?
I think, again, we can relate it back to physical first aid or medical first aid as well. You know, the more people who are appropriately trained to be able to identify and respond to medical emergencies, it means that people feel safer, they're able to get that initial first aid more quickly and then to be referred on to an appropriate health professional. So I think it's the same with mental health first aid. I think that there are people who might notice the changes in friends or families. They might be a little concerned about them, but might not feel confident or feel like they have the skills to be able to approach them and to know what to do if they say, yeah, I actually am struggling, you know, or I am having thoughts of suicide. So I think if we had more community members, more people in workplaces who understood what the signs and symptoms were of poor or declining mental health, or for people who might be vulnerable to or at risk of suicide, then I think we have more people who are able to reach out, who are able to care for one another, to support one another, and I think generally just feel more connected, you know, and I think it would also go some way in reducing the stigma that still exists potentially around, you know, mental illness and suicide as well. So if we create a more understanding community or workplace, people are also going to feel more supported. We know that, you know, the research says that around about 65% of people with symptoms of common mental illnesses don't get help. So that's like just over 6 out of 10 people don't seek professional help. So it means that there's a lot of mental illness that goes undiagnosed. There's people in our communities and neighbourhoods and workplaces who aren't actually getting the help they need. And I think that's where mental health first aid is so important, because not only can it equip people with the skills to identify what might be going on to someone, to approach them and have a conversation about it, but it's also about encouraging them to get appropriate help as well, because we know people are more likely to get help if someone close to them and someone they trust encourages them to do so.
I think there's lots of companies have the programs in place, where a referral program where you can talk to someone and things like that, but you've still got to make that step to call that number. But if you had someone that was there that could spot problems and spot any signs that are up, then it would be a massive benefit to a lot of people.
I absolutely agree. I wholeheartedly agree. And I think it lifts all of our capacity as a, you know, community and society to live and be well.
And if it was my workplace that maybe had like an EAP or something like that, like you mentioned, Ben, would it be, I guess, one of those things where they might be sitting back saying, look, you know, we've got the EAP, that's kind of there for everybody. Why would we need mental health first aiders, for example?
Yeah, and from a workplace perspective, it's interesting because the legislation's now changing around workplaces providing psychologically healthy workplaces, or doing what they can to minimise psychological risks as well. And workplaces have a responsibility both in terms of promoting mental health, being able to recognise mental illness, and being able to support people. So more and more organisations or workplaces need to have responses at a primary, secondary and tertiary kind of intervention level. And I think, again, this is where mental health first aid plays such an important role around that early intervention. So part of the prevention as well as the early intervention. I think EAPs are great as part of an overall strategy, as is, you know, mental health first aid as part of an overall strategy. And I think it goes back to what Ben just said. It's actually dialing that number. I think there's a big difference around having people skilled up to have those conversations in the workplace to having to ring a number, especially when you don't know the organisation or, who they are and those sorts of things. I think if there's someone in the workplace that can encourage or facilitate that help seeking, then I think that benefits everyone.
And Ben, what would you say to those workplaces who might be considering maybe putting some of their, team members or staff through the training like you've done?
Yeah, a terrific idea. It really is. It's just so different once you go through the training on how basic it is, really. You don't need a college degree or anything to get through. It's just simple. It really is simple, and it's well worth doing.
If somebody wanted to take the next step in terms of getting some more suicide prevention training for themselves or for the people in their workplace or anything like that, what would be the next step for them to do?
So depending on the level of training and interest, QPR training is a free training that's available via the Gippsland Primary Health Network website under the suicide prevention resources. So people can log in really easily and simply and then go through the online course. It doesn't take a lot of time and you do get a certificate at the end. If people are interested in mental health first aid courses, Mental Health First Aid Australia have a range of courses, and there's a raft of trainers available to facilitate mental health first aid. The standard mental health first aid is a 12-hour course, so it is a bigger commitment, although they do have both face-to-face and blended online training as well. As I mentioned before, Mental Health First Aid also have a 4-hour conversations about suicide training for people who are after more specific suicide intervention. And there's the assist training, so applied suicide intervention skills training that's available through Living Works as well. So mental health first aid is often a good place to start. If people want more information, Mental Health First Aid Australia have a whole range of guidelines that are freely available to anyone. So whether you've done the course or not, you can still check out their website and download the guidelines.
Excellent. So it doesn't sound like it's too onerous a task or too heavy a financial commitment in order to do all this sort of stuff.
No, not at all. I think it's fairly easy and accessible.
Yeah, and well worth just that little bit of time. Just that little bit of time and you'll change someone's life.
If any of the topics in this interview have affected you in any way, support is available via Lifeline on 13 11 14. For more information on receiving any of the training that Linda mentioned in the interview, or for more interviews, check out the Gippsland PHN website.